Welcome to Philippine Stories Deep Dive channel. Today, we're diving deep into a story that's been making headlines and sparking a lot of debate in the Philippines.
Mhm.
The Maharlika Investment Fund, or MIF for short.
Right.
It's kind of a giant national savings account,
Yeah.
but with a twist. It's actually designed to invest in a bunch of different assets with the goal of boosting the Philippine economy.
What's interesting here is that this is the Philippines' first sovereign wealth fund. It's a big move, and it raises a lot of questions about, how it's all going to be managed, what impact it will have.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely been a wild ride so far. The MIF has faced a ton of scrutiny from economists to senators. Even the Supreme Court is involved.
Yeah, if you think about the big picture, I mean, the success of this whole thing really hinges on its ability to attract foreign investments.
Yeah.
If they can convince global players that the Philippines is a safe and profitable place to put their money, it could unlock some serious economic growth. But that's a big if, and there are a lot of factors at play.
Right. So let's rewind a bit and talk about how this all got started.
Yeah.
The idea for the MIF actually came from the House of Representatives in late 2022.
Okay.
And you wouldn't believe how fast it initially passed.
Really?
We're talking just 17 days from proposal to approval.
Wow. That's quick for something like this.
Yeah, it is. That speed is definitely unusual for such a big financial undertaking.
Right.
It raises questions about whether there was even enough time for, thorough review and discussion and stuff.
I see.
Yeah, definitely raised some red flags. But even with all the concerns, the MIF was signed into law in July 2023 by President Bongbong Marcos Jr.
So on paper, what's the plan for the MIF? What are they hoping to achieve with all these investments?
Well, the stated goals are pretty ambitious. They want to boost the Philippine economy, obviously, by investing in a wide range of areas like infrastructure projects, real estate, and even foreign currencies. They're even looking to align these investments with the country's development goals, things like reducing poverty and inequality.
Interesting. So tying it into the Philippine Development Plan, that's focused on improving the lives of ordinary Filipinos.
Exactly.
If they invest wisely in infrastructure and job creation, it could have a direct impact on achieving those goals.
That's the hope, at least.
Yeah.
But not everyone's convinced that the MIF is going to be a success story. In fact, there are some serious concerns swirling around the fund.
Like what are some of the main concerns people have?
Well, one of the biggest fears is mismanagement and corruption.
Yeah.
People worry that the MIF could just become a breeding ground for shady dealings, especially considering, the Philippines' past experiences with financial scandals.
Yeah, I can see why people would be worried, especially with so much money involved. We're talking billions of dollars here.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that brings us to a specific example that keeps coming up. The 1MDB scandal in Malaysia.
Oh, yeah.
It involved a sovereign wealth fund that was supposed to help their economy, but ended up embroiled in allegations of massive corruption and money laundering.
The 1MGB scandal, it's definitely a cautionary tale for any country considering sovereign wealth funds.
Right. It shows how important strong safeguards and oversight really are.
Definitely. And speaking of risks, remember we mentioned that the MIF was originally supposed to be funded partly by contributions from pension funds like the Government Service Insurance System, GSIS, and the Social Security System, SSS.
Yeah, those are retirement savings for government and private sector workers. That's a pretty sensitive topic.
Very sensitive. When people found out those pension funds were potentially on the line, there was a huge backlash.
Wow, I bet.
Yeah, people were outraged.
I can imagine. It's one thing to invest the government's money, but putting people's retirement savings at risk is a whole other level.
Totally. The outcry was so intense that they actually ended up dropping the GSIS and the SSS as mandatory contributors.
Really? So they backed down on that?
They did. But here's the thing. They're still allowed to contribute if they want to.
Oh, so the option's still there.
Exactly. And that still makes people uneasy. They worry there might be pressure to contribute anyway,
Yeah.
and they're questioning the protections in place to safeguard these pension funds. That makes sense. How independent will those pension fund boards really be when making these decisions?
That's a good question, and one that we don't have a clear answer to yet. But beyond those pension fund concerns, there's another major issue that's been fueling opposition to the MIF, the way the law was rushed through Congress.
Right, that 17-day thing. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, because some argue it violated constitutional procedures. The Philippine Constitution requires bills to be passed with 3 readings on different days, unless there's an emergency.
And in this case, there wasn't an emergency, right?
Exactly. So Senator Aquilino Pimentel III and some former Ban Muna representatives, They decided to challenge the MIF's legality in court.
Wow, so it's gone to court. Things are getting serious. What are they saying exactly?
Their main point is that the law was hurried through without proper discussion, which potentially violates their rights as lawmakers.
So they're basically saying the whole process was messed up and therefore the law itself is invalid.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, the Supreme Court has decided to take on the case.
Wow.
They've even ordered key institutions like the Bangko Sentral in Pilipinas, the Land Bank of the Philippines, and the Development Bank of the Philippines to give their opinions on the MIF's legality.
The Bangko Sentral Ming Pilipinas, or BSP, that's essentially the Philippines' central bank, right? They manage the country's financial system. Why are they involved in this legal battle?
Well, they, along with the Land Bank and the Development Bank, they've all contributed funds to the MIF.
Ah, so they're stakeholders.
Exactly, which puts them right in the middle of this legal showdown.
This is getting complicated, so what happens next?
The Supreme Court's upcoming oral arguments are going to be crucial. Their decision could have huge implications for the future of the MIF. It could even determine if the fund survives at all.
This whole MIF thing, it's a developing story with a lot of twists and turns.
For sure.
And it's important to remember that this legal challenge is just one piece of the puzzle. There's still a lot more to unpack when it comes to the MIF.
Right. We haven't even touched on the controversy surrounding the proposed salary for the MIF's president and CEO, Rafael Consing Jr.
Wait, there's a salary controversy too. Tell me more.
Oh, it's a big one. Get ready for some drama, because that's what we'll be diving into next.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about this salary controversy. What's all the fuss about?
Yeah, fill me in.
Well, the proposed salary for the MIF's president and CEO, Rafael Consing Jr., is a whopping PHP 2.5 million per month.
PHP 2.5 million per month. Wow, that's a lot of money even for a high-level position.
It is. And to give you some context, that's almost as much as the governor of the Bangko Sentral in Pilipinas makes.
Oh, wow. Right, the Bangko Sentral in Pilipinas, we talked about them earlier, they're the Philippine central bank. They play a huge role in keeping the country's finances stable.
Exactly. And the fact that Consing Jr.'s proposed salary is pretty much equal to the BSB governor's has caused a lot of anger, especially among government officials.
I can see why.
Yeah, they're saying that the MIC, the corporation managing the MIF, it's basically a government entity.
Right.
So it has to follow certain rules and regulations.
So unlike the Bangko Sentral, which has some freedom with its finances, the MIF doesn't have the same power to set its own salaries.
Exactly. And Consing Jr.'s defense of his proposed salary hasn't really helped things.
What's he saying?
He's argued that he needs that much money to attract top talent, to be competitive with the private sector.
I mean, I get that. To get the best people, you got to pay them well. But shouldn't public service be about more than just making a ton of money? Makes you wonder about the MIF's priorities. Are they really focused on serving the Filipino people?
It's a good point. Critics are saying that the MIF is ultimately a public service, and its executives shouldn't be getting those huge private sector salaries. It's a clash between, market-driven pay and public service ideals.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And to make it even more complicated, the law itself is kind of vague about pay for different types of staff.
That's true. The law is clear about non-technical staff. They should be paid like other government employees. But it's not so clear about highly technical staff. How much should they get paid?
I see. So that vagueness is causing problems.
Yeah, it seems like Consing Jr. is using that ambiguity to justify his high salary. He's basically saying that highly technical staff, which would include him, should be paid like they would be in the private sector.
And I'm sure government officials are pushing back, saying that would set a bad example for other government agencies.
Right. If they let the MIF get away with these huge salaries, what's to stop others from demanding the same?
Exactly. It could create a domino effect of salary demands across the whole government.
So what's going to happen with this salary standoff? Any sign of a solution?
Hopefully.
Well, there might be some light at the end of the tunnel. Some government officials have suggested a compromise.
Oh, really? What is it?
A lower starting salary for Consing Jr., with the possibility of raises based on how well the MIF performs. He'd have to earn his big paycheck.
That makes a lot more sense. It ties his pay to the success of the fund.
Exactly. It could be a win-win for both sides.
How so?
Well, those worried about big salaries would at least know that Consing Jr. has to prove himself. And those who think he deserves to be paid competitively would see that he can earn a lot if he does a good job.
Yeah, that's a good point. But even if they figure out the salary thing, it's just one part of a much bigger picture. The MIF is still facing a lot of scrutiny, especially when it comes to transparency and accountability.
You're right. The salary controversy has actually highlighted the issue of transparency.
I see.
Critics are demanding more information about the MIF's structure, its investment strategy, and even how its board of directors was chosen.
Transparency is essential for any sovereign wealth fund, especially one that's been so controversial from the beginning. Without it, there's no way to know if the MIF is really working for the Filipino people or if it's just benefiting certain individuals.
Exactly. And that lack of transparency is creating suspicion about potential conflicts of interest. People are worried that the MIF could be used to help specific people or groups instead of the whole country.
Yeah, they basically want to see where the money's going and who's making the decisions.
And remember, we're talking about billions of dollars of public funds. This is people's savings, their tax money, their future. They deserve to know how it's being handled.
Absolutely. And it's not just about preventing outright corruption. It's also about maintaining public trust.
Right.
Even the appearance of impropriety can damage people's confidence in the MIF.
True.
If people lose faith in the fund, it doesn't matter how good its investments are. The whole thing could fall apart.
You're right. Perception matters a lot in this situation. And the calls for more transparency and accountability aren't just about preventing wrongdoing. They're about building public confidence in the MIF and making sure it lasts.
And honestly, they're about protecting the Philippines' reputation globally. No one wants to see this project become a scandal.
You got it. The stakes are high, and whether the MIF succeeds or fails will have a big impact on the Philippines and its people. But with all these concerns about salaries, transparency, and potential risks, there's one big question we can't ignore. What if the MIF law is declared unconstitutional?
Right. That legal challenge, it's the elephant in the room. We've talked about the economic worries and the controversies, but this legal battle could completely derail the whole MIF project.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court's decision on the constitutionality of the MIF law could change everything. It could either clear the way for the fund to move ahead or bring the whole thing crashing down.
That sounds like a good place to pick up in part 3.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground,
Right.
but the legal battle is probably the most important part of the MIF story. The outcome could have huge consequences for the Philippines, its economy, and its future. So we talked about the economic worries, the salary drama, the calls for transparency, but now let's get into that legal battle hanging over the Maharlika Investment Fund.
This is where things could get really interesting. A legal challenge to a sovereign wealth fund, especially one as high profile as this one, it's not something you see every day.
It's a big deal, for sure. And the arguments they're making in this case, they really challenge the whole foundation of the MIF.
So let's break it down for our listeners. Who are the main players in this legal fight, and what are their big arguments against the MIF?
Okay, so the petition to declare the MIF law unconstitutional was filed by a group of senators and former representatives led by Senator Coco Pimentel.
Right.
Their argument is that the law was basically rushed through Congress. They say it violated constitutional procedures and undermined the whole legislative process.
So it all goes back to that 17-day rush job we talked about. They're saying there wasn't enough time for proper review and debate.
Exactly. They say rushing through something this complex and important, especially when you're talking about billions of dollars of public money, it's not just reckless, it's potentially illegal.
I get it. To them, it's one thing to speed up a bill if there's a real emergency.
Right.
But this wasn't a natural disaster or a national crisis. Are they also saying there are problems with the MIF itself beyond just how fast it was passed?
Oh, yeah. They're claiming that the law basically hands over huge amounts of public money to what they call unknown fund managers and an amorphous board of directors.
So besides the procedural stuff, they're worried about the structure of the MIF, how it's managed, and the potential for things to go wrong.
Exactly. They're basically saying that the MIF, as it stands right now, doesn't have enough safeguards to prevent things like mismanagement, conflicts of interest, or even outright corruption.
That's a serious accusation. And it's not just coming from this group of petitioners, right? We've talked about how economists and even some business groups have expressed similar concerns.
Exactly. It's not just a few people complaining. There are a lot of people from different areas who are worried about the same things.
And that's why this legal challenge is so important. It's not just about procedures. It's a debate about the very legitimacy of the MIF, how it's structured, and what it could mean for the Philippines.
But don't forget, the Supreme Court has decided to hear this case. That in itself tells you how serious this is.
Right. The Supreme Court doesn't just take on any case. The fact that they're looking into the constitutionality of the MIF law means this isn't just a political debate anymore. It's a full-blown legal battle with huge potential consequences.
So what are the possible outcomes here? What happens if the Supreme Court sides with the petitioners and says the MIF law is unconstitutional?
That would be a huge blow to the MIF and to the Marcos administration. It would mean the whole project has to be scrapped, or at least completely redesigned. Think about all the time, effort, and money already spent on setting up the MIF. It would all be thrown into chaos.
It would be a major setback for
Yeah.
sure, and it would send shockwaves through the Philippine economy and the investment community. People have already started making plans and allocating resources based on the idea that the MIF would be up and running.
So what about the other side? What happens if the Supreme Court says the MIF law is constitutional?
Well, that would be a huge win for the Marcos administration and a clear signal for the MIF to go ahead. It would get rid of a lot of uncertainty and let the fund start operating without this legal challenge looming over it.
But even then, I don't think the concerns about transparency, accountability, and good governance are just going to vanish overnight.
You're right. Even if the MIF wins this legal battle, it's still going to have to work hard to earn the public's trust and show that it can operate in a way that benefits the whole country, not just a select few.
They need to prove to the Filipino people that they can be trusted. They need to be open and accountable and make ethical decisions. If they don't, the skepticism and doubt will stick around, and the MIF will always be operating under a cloud of suspicion.
That's true. So it's not just about winning this legal fight. It's about winning over the Filipino people, convincing them that the MIF is a good thing, a way to achieve progress and prosperity, not a breeding ground for corruption or mismanagement.
Exactly. The Maharlika Investment Fund has the potential to be a game changer for the Philippines. It could drive economic growth, create jobs, and boost infrastructure development.
But it comes with big risks, too. If it's not managed well, it could become a burden on the Filipino people, leading to debt and financial instability. It could even hurt the country's global reputation.
This deep dive into the MIF has been a fascinating journey. It's been exciting and a little bit scary at times. We've looked at its origins, its ambitious goals, the controversy surrounding it, and the legal challenge that could shut it all down.
It's a story that's still unfolding, with many chapters left to be written. The Supreme Court's decision on the constitutionality of the MIF law will be a crucial turning point.
Absolutely.
It'll determine the fate of the fund and maybe even shape the future of the Philippines.
So what will it take for the Maharlika Investment Fund to truly benefit the Philippines and its people? I guess only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, the world is watching.
And the Filipino people are waiting, hoping for a better future. We'll keep following the story of the Maharlika Investment Fund, and we'll be here to keep you updated on all the twists and turns along the way.